So today we have the privilege of hearing from Cate Klundt. Cate is a good friend of mine and is an excellent, she's just a pleasure to listen to. Cate is the Government Affairs Director for the Utah Association of Realtors, where she's been there for about 3 years, or I guess 4 years now. Prior to that, she worked as the Community and Government Relations Director for the World Trade Center in Utah. And prior to that, she was the Communications Director for the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools. So Cate has been in and around the Utah legislature for a very long time and probably has a lot of stories that state legislators would like not to be made public, but none of them are here, so you can tell all the stories you want. Prior to that, she was the Deputy Press Secretary for the Utah House of Representatives, and prior to that, was a student at BYU in the political science department. Cate, just on a personal note, Cate is married to my former roommate at BYU, Jared Klundt, and they have a lovely corgi dog named Pancakes. Right, Pancakes? Okay. So please give a round of applause for Cate Klundt.
Okay, thank you for having me. This is how networking works, right? Just marry the guy who was roommates with the poli-sci professor, and they'll invite you back to speak. Like, easy, done. Like Professor Barber said, I have been around the legislature for a long time, actually. I realized, thanks to Facebook reminding me about some of the embarrassing things I posted like 10 years ago, I was reminded this is my 10-year anniversary at the legislature. Because I started working there when I was at BYU. So I'm gonna give you just a little bit of background about what I studied at BYU and how I got my first job. And then I'll talk a little bit about bouncing around the different jobs that I did and some of the things that I learned. And then I'll answer any questions that you may have. That sounds good. So I came to BYU in 2008, and I graduated in 2013, which means it took me 5 years to do one of the shortest majors at BYU, which is should be embarrassing. But what I ended up doing was I got a job at the legislature during the legislative session. And in Utah, that runs from January to March, which is right smack in the middle of winter semester. So what I did for a couple of years is I would take winter semester off, and then I would take spring and summer classes and fall classes, and then I would go back and take winter semester off and work at the legislature again. And the way that this happened is I was taking a media and American politics class from Professor Davis, and I met someone named Angie Welling, and she had been the press secretary for Governor Huntsman and then Governor Herbert. And she was just a random public speaker that came to talk to our class about her job. And have you guys ever seen The West Wing? Usually there's like a good chunk of poli-sci kids who've seen The West Wing. I watched that, and I wanted C.J. Craig's job so badly, but I knew that I wasn't going to be going to the White House. And so I was like, there's got to be something similar that is closer to me, something that is like attainable. And Angie came and talked about being the press secretary, communications deputy for Governor Huntsman and Governor Herbert, and I was like, this is it. Like, this is exactly what a small-time C.J. Craig would do. And so I badgered the crap out of Angie. As soon as the class was over, I thanked her for coming, just everything annoying that you can think of. I gave her my email address. I asked for her email address. I asked her like a million questions. And she was very gracious and very kind to me because I know that I was annoying. I know that I was. And what ended up happening was Speaker Lockhart, who was the first female speaker of the Utah House of Representatives in Utah, she needed a communications intern. And it technically wasn't an internship, it was a job because they were gonna give me some money for it and I wasn't gonna get school credit for it. But I ended up interviewing because Angie had given my email address to her chief of staff. And it was basically just because I was so annoying that I was memorable. And she was like, I think I have that girl's email somewhere. And this guy has asked if I know anybody in college. And so that's how I ended up getting my first job, because as soon as I graduated from BYU, I went on full time at the Utah House of Representatives. And so I worked for Speaker Lockhart for the last 3 years that she was the speaker, and then I worked for Greg Hughes for the first session that he was speaker to help their team kind of transition. And it was at that point that I realized when you're a government employee, it's not super flexible. And for me, those constraints were only worth it if I really loved the politician that I was working for, because there are constraints. And a lot of that is that they're very strict about time off. They're very strict about your salary. They're very strict about coming into work. I'm really hoping that like with the work from home stuff with COVID has helped that for some of the state employees, because I don't know that it was necessarily the most efficient, but it was very stringent. And I came to this realization that I didn't really love what I was doing anymore because the person that I had loved working for was not there anymore. And so in political science and in government affairs, which is what I ended up transitioning to, so I studied poli-sci, but I also minored in communications. And that gave me a huge leg up when it came to looking for a job in political science, because I didn't want to get a master's degree or a PhD. I still don't, I'll be honest. You don't really have to twist my arm to go back. But it gave me the writing skills that I needed to be able to apply for some of these jobs. And it gave me a body of work that I needed to be able to apply for some of these jobs. Because when you're writing press releases, they look very different than the papers that you write for 328 or any of those kinds of classes. Anyway, so I studied communications and political science. And so as I was transitioning into government affairs, with government affairs, it's not usually a very linear thing. It's not like you go to one firm and you stay there for 20 years and you retire top of the firm. There's a lot of bouncing around, and there's a lot of going from organization to organization. And what essentially you're doing is the same job, but as you get better at it, you'll do it for larger and larger associations or larger and larger groups, or you'll go in-house somewhere, or you can start as a lobbyist and take your own clients and that kind of thing. So when I was looking to leave the Utah House, I asked some of the lobbyists that I knew if they knew of any job openings. And I ended up at the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools, which is a really, really small association. There were only 5 full-time employees. I was their 6th. I was the youngest, but I think like 25 years. And I really enjoyed it because I had a really, really good boss. And one of the things that I kind of want to talk about is I had a lot of really great male mentors. And that's not something that every woman in politics gets. It's not something that every woman gets, just like period. But where I had them, I feel like it's really important for me to recognize them and to encourage anyone who might end up being a male mentor to be able to do the same thing, because it's really, really important to when we're talking about the gender wage gap, when we're talking about equality in the workplace, that you have good female mentors as well as male mentors. If I waited for a female mentor, I'd still be waiting, right? So I had some really great male mentors, and at the Utah Association of Public Charter Schools, I ended up taking a pay cut to go there. And I did that because it was the job I wanted in the field that I wanted, even though it wasn't exactly the amount of money that I wanted. And I was pretty privileged in that I was married to someone that had a job, so I could mooch off of him for a little while I got my feet under me. And it ended up being a really good move for me because I wasn't a state employee anymore. I had a good boss, and I learned a lot. Mostly, I was put in charge of something for the first time. I was not staff, I was the director of communications, and even though it was for a really small little area and nonprofit, it was mine, and it was my responsibility, and it kind of ended with me. And that taught me a lot. So from there, I moved to the World Trade Center in Utah, which is a nonprofit that helps connect Utah businesses with international business opportunities, which is really, really specific. And but it was a lot of really, really interesting work, and I ended up doing a lot of international relations with it as well. And so my crowning achievement there was that I took a bunch of senators and representatives to China, and I didn't lose any of them. They all came back. Nobody created a diplomatic incident. We all got out of there, and it was great. But I only stayed at that job for a year. So I was at the charter schools for 2.5, almost 3 years. I was at World Trade Center for a year, and then I went over to the Utah Association of Realtors, where I've been. This is the longest time I've ever been in a job, which is 4 years. But that is because of just the nature of this work. You're not going to stay in one place, and that can be a little scary. It's very much more entrepreneurial than if you were to, say, go to law school or to get your MBA, because you are going to be taking risks and taking chances, and no matter how much you plan, you're totally going to mess up, and it's just kind of like a given. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity to do that at some smaller organizations before I got to some larger organizations. because the lessons I learned, they stung a lot less when they impacted fewer people. So that's how I got to where I am right now. A little bit about my job responsibilities. So I'm the Government Affairs Director, which means that I take care of all of the policy for the Realtors Association. And what that means is they pay me to track legislation that can impact their industry. This is everything from affordable housing to tax reform to water policy to private property rights, eminent domain, all of that stuff. We even did some work on some homelessness bills and some electric vehicle charging station bills this year. It can get very specific. But because they don't want to deal with it, they pay me to. I track it during the session, and then me and my CEO and our other lobbyists, we work on those bills during the session. And then for the rest of the year, we're still working on those issues. A lot of times, some of the issues that we're dealing with are very complicated, and they'll go to interim, and we'll work on them through the summer into the fall, and then they'll come back the next year. So that's one aspect of my job, is the policy part. The other part is campaigns and fundraising. So we have one of the largest PACs in the state. We fundraise from our members exclusively. You have to be a realtor. And there's a difference between a real estate agent and a realtor. A realtor pays a membership fee to the Realtors Association. There are a certain number of CE credits that are associated with that. And so that's kind of like the difference between being certified to do something and not being certified to do something. You don't have to be a realtor to be a good real estate agent, but you can't call yourself a realtor unless you pay the dues. But if you're a realtor, you have a specific ID, and so that's how we fundraise for our PAC. And I'll say the average realtor in Utah makes about $55,000 a year, probably maybe 60. They sell maybe 3 or 4 homes a year. A lot of them do it part-time. A lot of women. This is like one of the only industries where there are more women than men in this profession, and there is no wage gap. Everybody makes the same amount of money. So some of our highest earners are women. So I fundraise, and then we send that money to candidates that we think are what we call realtor champions. So people that promote private property rights, people who are interested in solving the affordable housing crisis, people who are interested in low property taxes, that kind of thing. And we're not a partisan organization. We work across the aisle. We work with Democrats on affordable housing and low-income housing. And we worked on a mobile home park bill this last little while. We work with Republicans on a bunch of things. And then we work sometimes with members of both parties on certain issues. So not partisan, which is kind of nice. Because when you're a lobbyist, it can be kind of hard to find an issue that you're willing to go to bat for all the time. I can say that home ownership is one that I'm really comfortable going to bat for all the time. It has never made me question my morals or wonder if I was going to get into heaven. I am a lobbyist, so that question comes up. So that's kind of what I do now. And I'm going to get on a little bit of a soapbox really quickly because we do give money to legislators for their campaigns, and we are considered a special interest group. Something that I've noticed recently is that people are very critical of politicians who take money from special interest groups. And my problem with that, not only because I am the one giving the money, because I'm self-interested, no. My problem is that campaigning is really, really expensive. And I don't think that you should have to be as rich as Mitt Romney to be able to run for office. And without taking donations from special interest groups, and this can be any special interest group, Realtors are one, the Teachers Association is another, the Medical Association is another. The average person who I think would end up being really, really good in the legislature isn't going to have the money to run for office. It can cost anywhere between $40,000 and $60,000 to run for a Senate race here, and between $15,000 and $30,000 to run for a House seat here. So I don't want only bajillionaires to be running for office and serving in the Utah State Legislature. I think one of the coolest things we have is a citizens legislature. So there are lots of randoms up there with all different kinds of jobs and all different kinds of perspectives. So I would tell a candidate to take money from anybody. They're not beholden to me because they take my money. Sometimes it feels like the opposite, is that they go out of their way to make sure that I know that they're not beholden to me because they took my check. But I like it that way. And it's a good way to fund campaigns. It's a good way to even the playing field for people who may not be independently wealthy. And the lobbying rules in Utah are very strict, and I think it's a good thing. They've really tightened up the last 15, 20 years, I want to say, probably closer to 15. I can only spend $35 on a meal, so we can go to Taqueria 27 as long as they don't order a dessert and an appetizer. And I can't give a gift more than $10 or $10. Not that I want to give them gifts, I don't really. But like when you get to DC, they go on trips, they go on vacation together, and I can't think of anything worse than going on vacation with the legislature. So I went to China for work, and it was like one of the worst things to see those people in such an intimate setting. And so I never want to go on vacation with legislators. So I'm really glad that in Utah that's not the case. That the most that we can do is go to lunch. That's really all I need. So that's just a little bit about lobbying. I am a registered lobbyist. There are lots of different kinds of lobbyists. There's what I do, which is for an association. There are lobbyists for nonprofits. There are lobbyists for that just take clients. They're client-based lobbyists. They're independent contractors, and they have their own firms. And that's probably the way I'll go, just because it's flexible. And the association life isn't long-term because, like I said, you can't really move up. You've got to move over and up into something else and something different. But I've still got a ways to go at the Realtors. I like them a lot. Okay, so before I open it up to questions, I'm just going to give you one piece of advice that stuck with me for a really, really long time. And when I was in high school, I was a student council nerd, which is not a surprise to anyone here or what I chose to do with my career. But we had a kind of a cheesy public speaker come in, and he was talking to us about leadership and just kind of making us all feel special. And one of the things that he said was, don't do what you love, do what you're good at. And I remember thinking that it was just like total crap. Like, I can totally do what I love, and I'll be amazing at it, because I was like 16, and I thought I was amazing at everything. But it was something that I thought about a lot more as I started going to school, as I got to BYU, as I started looking for internships. If I did what I love, I would be an out-of-work Broadway actress in Brooklyn with like 8 roommates and no money, and I would have never started anything. Because as much as I love musicals, I was not good enough to be on Broadway. I was never gonna be good enough to be on Broadway. And there was not any amount of like dance lessons or vocal lessons that could make up for the fact that I loved it, but I came to it late, and I also just am not that good of a dancer. So it just wasn't gonna happen for me. And instead of taking that and being just miserable at trying to do this thing that I loved and failing to achieve it constantly, I took my love for communicating and, performing in a way, because I did debate and I still talk to people on a regular basis and give public testimony. So I still took my love of the limelight to something else, which was political science, and it was lobbying and communications and telling a story, but telling a story in a different way, not on Broadway. And because of that, I have found success, and that success has made me feel even better about myself. Because if you choose something that you're not super great at, like if I had tried for Broadway, I would have been beaten down every single time I went to an audition and I didn't get the part. And that can take a toll on you. And I think that lots of times now we get wrapped up in the fact that our career is our identity, and that it has to be something that we are passionate about, that it has to be like our main personality trait, because if it's not, then we haven't sacrificed enough or we don't love it enough. But your job should be a job. It should be something that helps you feel fulfillment, something that helps you provide for yourself or for your family, but it does not have to be your whole self. And that was something that I learned going through this process that I wish, I came to it earlier, and I'm glad for that, but I wish that I had had some more serious conversations about this earlier on. Because I still feel really fulfilled by what I do. Every single time that I can give an argument to a legislator that I think is worthwhile and see them understand what I'm trying to do, and see a massive piece of legislation that I've tried to pass and actually get signed and actually get funded, I still feel really fulfilled in that. But it's not Broadway, and I'm glad for that. Okay, so now that that's all over, do you have any questions for me?
So if you have questions for those who are new, we want you to go over to the microphone over there, because we're doing this over Zoom and recording, so that way everyone can hear the questions. So just get up, go over there, and ask. There's usually like an awkward 20 seconds where we kind of testimony meeting style wait to see.
There we go. There's one.
There we go. Okay, we've broken the silence.
Well
Okay.
done.
I mean, I can just keep talking. I don't have to ask any questions. It just won't be that useful, probably.
So you talked about how you moved from communications in the legislature into lobbying. What was your thought process like with that? I assume that at that point you had experience with lobbyists and maybe you saw what they were doing and were attracted to that. Why was that? And what were you thinking about going into that?
Yeah. So when I was working at the House, I had the chance to work on some very specific issues. Medicaid expansion was one of them. Modernizing like technology and education was another, and those were like deep dives on topics that I really enjoyed. And so the idea that I could specialize in a topic was really appealing to me, policy-wise, so that I could choose one and I could really go deep on that. When I worked at the legislature, I had to know a little bit about a lot of things, and then I need to know a lot about the budget, and the budget is the worst. But it was a fun thing, genuinely. It was an interesting thing to learn about and to be able to explain. But what I saw, and there will always be good lobbyists and bad lobbyists. Like there will always be people who think that they're on House of Cards, but really like they're in Parks and Rec. Like they think that they are Kevin Spacey, but they are not. They are not. They are in Parks and Rec, and they don't know that. Bless their hearts. And so there are some lobbyists that will be really, really good, and there'll be some that are really bad. And because I was at the state, I had a chance to see both kind of in action. And honesty and truth, that's like currency on the Hill. If I worked there for 10 years now. I plan to work there for the rest of my career. If I were to flat out lie to a legislator right now about an issue because I was trying to get a bill passed, they wouldn't want to work with me again. That would be a huge hit to my reputation. That's only so many times that can happen before you're just gone. And so this idea that like you can have all of these like backroom machinations and that you can bribe your way through something or that you can kind of skate around the truth to pass something. It's not necessarily true at the state level. I honestly don't know what happens in DC. I try my very best to not know what happens in DC. I don't like it. I think that the state is a much more interesting place to work and to study. So I was able to see good lobbyists and bad lobbyists. And the bad lobbyists, they're the skeezy ones. They're the ones who were like, let's go to Ruth's Chris and let me tell you about why this bill is so amazing, without disclosing that this bill is like for a friend of theirs and that they also have purchased land around this place that the prison is gonna go and that they're very invested in moving that thing. I'm seem like I'm not specific at all. Just like a couple times this has happened. No, so it behooves me to be upfront, and it matters to me to be honest, and I watched a lot of really good lobbyists do that the right way. Because at the end of the day, genuinely what happens is I'm presenting one argument, the lobbyist on the opposite side of the table from me is presenting another argument, and it's up to the legislature to decide how they want to fix that problem. And I'll give you a really quick example. So this is the first year that I started taking private clients, and it scared the crap out of me because I had never done it on my own. I had always worked with another lobbyist, a lead lobbyist. And so this was the first time. And I got a bill about medical liens. Are any of you guys familiar with medical liens? I would be so sad for you if you were, because it's a really terrible topic. But it turns out the chiropractic industry in Utah is like the mob. There are a lot of back deals and bribes happening, a lot of like kickbacks. I had no idea. It's very odd, very weird. But Senator Bramble, who is around this area, was running a bill, and there was another lobbyist who represented a company that was a finance company that purchased medical liens. So when you get in a car accident and you can't pay for your care, what happens is they'll take out a medical lien on you, and they will front the cost for your care until the end of your settlement. Utah is one of the only states where they settle at the end of your care rather than in the middle of your care, so that they cover the full cost. Anyway, long story short, this bill essentially would have made it impossible for healthcare providers to create and hold liens, but it gave an opening for financial companies to create and hold liens. And it was a bill that was run by a financial company, and I had a medical provider hire me to basically say, wait a second, why would financial companies be allowed to do this if medical providers cannot do this? If no one can do it, no one can do it, but there shouldn't be exceptions made for financial companies. And I got to this bill really, really late in the process. It had already passed the House, it had already passed the Senate, and it had gone to concurrence already. And so it was on the concurrence board, and that is like, I don't know if you guys know this, but that is like its last gasp. And so we were able to talk the House sponsor into refusing to concur with the amendments that the Senate made, and so we went to a conference committee, which is where representatives from the House and representatives from the Senate get together and have a meeting, and they kind of hammer out how they're gonna fix this bill. And we had 4 conference committees. This has not happened at the legislature in a really, really long time, but it was a really complicated bill, and it had a lot of like players involved. But we both had arguments, good arguments to make. Well, I mean, I think mine were better than theirs, obviously. But we both had arguments to make. And at the end of the day, it was up to Representative Ferring and Senator Bramble to decide what they were gonna do with their bill. We had suggestions, they had suggestions, and we made our case the best that we could. Luckily, they pulled that section of the bill out and they sent it to interim, so we'll study it over the summer, which I'm not like stoked about. I don't really wanna work on this for the rest of the year, but it's much better than passing bad legislation. So that's just kind of like one situation in which you're really, it's so much about talking to people, and it's so much about just having conversations and listening to what their problems with the bill are and sharing your problems with the bill and things like that. And that's what appealed to me. That's what I saw lobbyists do. I saw them having lots and lots of conversations.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
So I have 2 questions
Okay.
because nobody's coming up. So come up and ask a question. Question number 1 is, if you were to give advice to students who don't plan to be lobbyists,
Yeah.
but who want to influence a legislative body, say the legislature or a city council, what would you tell them about how to have influence over policy as a regular citizen? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And question number 2, totally unrelated, but maybe related, is can you give us any insight into what in the world happened at the end of the legislative session with the bill about transgender sports?
Yeah, actually, yeah. So the first one I'll say, and this is the reason that I like state government more than I like federal government. I think that you can see the impact for change in a much more tangible way. I can shake my fist at what Congress does. I can call my senators, my representatives, but I don't see a lot of my influence there. When I'm talking about things on a city level or a state level, then I'm able to see kind of how I'm able to make more of an impact. So one thing that I would say to do is that in Utah, we have a caucus and a primary system. There are 2 ways to get to the ballot. If you guys are registered in your home state, I would encourage you to register in Utah instead. You should always be registered where you live. Because even if you're only here for 4 years, it's gonna impact you so much. And the caucus system is a really good way for you to meet your legislators and to meet the other people in your community who are very vocal and to share your opinion. It seems like the biggest waste of time because it's full of crazy people sometimes. It is, and it can be hours long. I feel bad about how long it can be. But I learned a long time ago that the motion to adjourn is non-debatable. So keep that in your pocket. So I would get involved in the caucus system. In Utah specifically, if you're talking about your city council people and your representatives and your senators, if you email them, put in your subject line, I am your constituent, and then the topic of what you'd like to talk about. They get so many emails and text messages and phone calls that if you just say, hey, this is Cate, I'm your constituent, I'd really like to talk to you about HB 170, whatever. Then they are much more likely to look at your email and to read it and to respond. More likely than they are to respond to my email, even. Lobbyists can be effective, but constituents are always more effective because they're the ones who actually vote for legislators. And I would text them. The thing is, like, they're very accessible, and it's not actually super difficult to get a hold of them if you have some issues that you'd like to talk about. And that doesn't even have to be something that's already happening at the legislature. If you have an issue that you've run into that you think could be solved and you have an idea for a legislator, I would say 60 to 70% of the bills that happen are ideas that constituents brought to their legislators because they encountered a problem somewhere. And then the rest of them are problems that they encountered as a citizen legislature in their own professions that they're trying to solve. That's kind of where those ideas come from. So if you have an idea about what you'd like to solve, reach out. They'll 100% get back to you, and if they don't, text me, and I'll tell them to. And with the city council meetings, no one goes to them because they are also long and boring. But if you show up a couple times and they start to recognize you, then not hard to grab their ear and to have a conversation with them. I stay away from my neighborhood Facebook group because it is toxic and terrible. And right now it is full of stuff about Utah Lake and skyscrapers and just a whole lot of things that aren't true. And if you want to talk about Utah Lake, we can talk about Utah Lake, but there are no skyscrapers that will be built in Utah Lake. I'm not even sure where that rumor came from. But that's literally the worst way to get a hold of a city council person is to comment on something on Facebook, because I can guarantee they tune it out the way that I tune it out. It's not helpful. So email them, text them. City council people get younger and younger, which means they're better and better at technology for the most part. So yeah, I would just say that make sure that you say that you're a constituent when you're reaching out. Okay, as for the trans bill, I actually think this is really gross.
So you might need to give a little background about this.
Yeah, so last year, Representative Kira Birkeland ran a bill that had to do with trans youth participating in high school sports, middle school and high school sports. And it was a ban on trans youth participating in that sport. It did not pass last session, but they did have a couple committee hearings about it, and they had a lot of debate. And Governor Cox said that he would veto the bill if it came to his desk. And so rather than take up that issue last year, the legislature just kind of let it die, and they pushed it toward the interim, which is March to about November. And they meet once a month for official committee meetings, but they meet all year long with different interest groups to work on legislation. And what happened was Equality Utah and the Pride Center and some other special interest groups that represent the queer community were negotiating with Representative Birkeland about the process by which trans youth could participate in high school and what that process would look like. If it would look like what the ICC does at the Olympics, if it would look like what the NCAA does, or if it would look like something totally different. So how many of you are familiar with ALEC, the American Legislative, Exchange Council? Okay. It's a very conservative group. And ALEC will occasionally put out boilerplate bills that are about what they consider to be important topics of the day. And this is one of those bills. This was like something that Representative Birkeland cares about, but she didn't write this. This came from a special interest group in DC. So that's what the genesis of the bill. They worked on it all session, all of interim, and they brought it to this legislative session, and they had come to what both sides had agreed was a compromise, which was, and the thing is, what's hard about these bills is what a compromise in the House looks like is not what a compromise in the Senate looks like. And so when you're debating the nuances of something like this, changes that they make in the House may not be welcome in the Senate and vice versa. So it's a complicated negotiation process because you have lots of big personalities on an issue like this. Essentially what happened though was they decided there was gonna be a commission for trans youth. And what would happen is if you had a trans youth that would like to participate in, say, women's soccer, then they would go before this commission with a doctor. They'd evaluate basically where they were in their puberty cycle, what their muscle mass was like. They even talked about doing measurements of shoulder width and things like that, which would have been bad for me because I have the shoulders of a linebacker. So big jackets. But that was kind of the compromise that they came to, was that there would be this commission and it would be made up of legislators and doctors and high school athletics coaches and things like that, and representatives from the school districts and the school board. So it was kind of on its way. It passed the House fine, it passed the Senate fine, but it was after it passed the Senate that it passed the House fine, and before it went to the Senate, there started to be some rumblings that there were senators who were not comfortable with the measurements. They thought that it was kind of pervy and weird, and I would have to agree. That being so specific about measurements for children is kind of odd, but it is a really, really complicated issue. And there's a big difference, in my opinion, and I'm 100% just sharing opinions at this point, between the situation with Leah Thomas and the situation with a 13-year-old who would like to play girls soccer. Very different bodies, very different stages of puberty, very different outcomes. And I think that by not addressing the issues with the Leah Thomas situation, we are actually doing our trans youth in middle school and high school a disservice, and we're making it much more difficult for them to participate. But now that we're away from my opinion. Before it got to the Senate, there started to be some grumbling that they weren't okay with the measurements. And Governor Cox has started to come out and say to some of the legislators, I'm not going to sign this if you keep the measurement portion in there. So it went to the Senate committee, they took out the measurement portion, which essentially, in Representative Birkeland's mind, gutted the bill. And she didn't like it. And many people didn't like it. And so the rumor that I heard initially on the second to last day of the session was that they were going to substitute that bill for one that basically said that if the Supreme Court, that they would have the commission, but if the Supreme Court said that it was banned, it would be banned. What happened was the opposite, was they substituted the bill on the Senate floor, and essentially what that bill says is that trans youth are banned from participating in Utah sports until the Supreme Court ruling says otherwise. At which point it would revert to a commission, like they had initially talked about. So they did this at 10:30 on the last night of the session. They adjourned at midnight. I would encourage you to go listen to the debate in the Senate as they talk about the substitute. I think people make some really good arguments about the process that bills are supposed to go through, about the need to check in with their constituents for input about bills, especially that pertain to children and to things that people feel very strongly about. But it passed the Senate at a much closer vote than I thought, actually, and it went to the House and it passed the House. And Governor Cox said that he would not sign it, and he has refused to sign it. And so now the legislature is talking about holding a special session to, or a veto override session, to override his veto.
What was the margin that it passed by veto-proof? Was it that?
Not in the Senate.
So it's possible that they might not succeed at overriding the veto.
Yeah, it's possible. I don't think that they would agree to call a veto override session if they didn't have the votes. They don't usually do that because it's bad PR for everybody, unless they know that they can pass it. At least when I worked there, that's how we functioned, and I don't think it's that much different, because you don't want any wild cards when you go into a special session because it's very short. But that's essentially what happened with the bill. The thing is, like, there are some situations where I'm really proud of our legislative process, and there are some situations, like with this bill, where I think it's pretty gross. Like, I mean, the policy aside, the process that this bill went through was a good one. And it was the product of a lot of negotiation and the input of a lot of different interested parties. It's like that saying where everyone should be unhappy with the finished product. That's how you know that you've got something that's good, is that nobody feels like they won. And that's kind of where everybody was. And then they decided to swap it out. And I don't know, this is an election year, and so my hypothesis is that a lot of what you'll see, what we did see this session, were bills that they think will help them win re-election. Many, many Republicans in Utah have people running to the right of them this year, which is kind of funny because that doesn't happen super often. I think the last time it happened in an overwhelming capacity was in 2010. And from my caucus and what I've noticed about the caucuses that my friends and my realtors have gone to and told me about is that it's worse than 2010. That it's just as intense as the Tea Party movement, if not more so. And I'm really curious to see what happens during the convention and during the primary process, because one of the senators who is actually in Senate majority leadership, she's from up north, Senator Milner, she voted no on the trans bill, and she did not collect signatures because she did not anticipate having a candidate run to the right of her. So now she is in a very contested race for her seat. So it's very likely that her bill, or that her vote on this trans bill, will be the thing that makes it so that she does not get reelected. But that's kind of a downer. There are good things that happen.
Somebody ask a better question.
Yeah.
Hi, yeah, I'm just interested what the day-to-day life is as a lobbyist, and kind of like what someone going into your field might be able to expect to experience, just like a day in the life type situation.
Yeah. So I chose this job because it's not the same every day. That was something that I looked for. My mom's an accountant, and she wanted to do the exact same thing every day, and she does. And she loves it, but I didn't want that. So what my year, I'll say like in a year, usually looks like is from January to March, I am incredibly busy. I basically live at the Capitol, and we do all of our session stuff. So I put on a policy summit for my realtors before the session starts, because my job isn't only to communicate with legislators, it's also to communicate with my members and make sure that they know what's going on. And I have 20,000 of them. And they can be really, really useful when I need them to email their legislators, but they have to know what I'm talking about for that to be the case. So we do a policy summit, like a preview, before the legislative session starts. So I'll plan that and invite legislators to come and talk about housing legislation, private property rights legislation, that kind of thing. Then we have the session. And then after the session, we have a period where we're waiting for our bills to be signed. That's where we are right now. After the session, I usually disappear for like 2 weeks. And this time I went to Europe to disappear. And I got back like an hour before this started. So sorry if I was a little late. But so that's usually, I can take a vacation 2 times a year. One is right after the session and right before Christmas. So that's kind of the rest of it is very busy. But that's because I also participate in elections. So for the rest of the year, my day-to-day looks a lot like talking to people about issues that we're working on through the rest of the year. Right now, that is unreinforced masonry. So when your walls fall down after an earthquake, we have an issue about that. We have an issue about electric vehicle chargers and HOAs and them adopting a policy and that kind of thing. All sorts of issues. And so I'll work on those day to day and meeting with different people and stuff as time goes on. Right now we're working on interviewing candidates for the primary to decide who we're going to give money to. The way that we do that is we have a questionnaire that is essentially asking them their opinions about a bunch of things that we care about, and then we have local boards all over the state. They invite them to come and interview. I kind of sit in and listen to see how crazy they are. And they ask some questions and we get a feel for what they're like. And then if we end up supporting them, then we'll offer them money, but we'll also offer them campaign help. So sometimes I become a de facto campaign manager. I have walked and knocked doors. I've made signs. I've made mailers. I've written convention speeches, all sorts of random stuff. It's what we can offer them because campaigns are so expensive. It's kind of how we can also show our support without giving them money that would sink their campaign because we gave them money if that becomes an issue. So I work on the primaries through June. We have a little bit of a break, and then starting in August, we start to work on the general elections. And for some districts, those are contested. For most in Utah, they're not. Usually our really, really busy session is during the primary season. But during the fall, we start to work a lot more on those issues that will be coming up that next legislative session. So we start to draft language, we start to talk to bill sponsors. So because the sooner that you can get an issue up during the legislature, the better chance it has of passing. So we try to get those all kind of buttoned up before Election Day in November, because people go out of town for Thanksgiving and for Christmas, and we want to be all set before that. Then we have Election Day, and then I can take a vacation kind of, and then we go right into December, getting ready for the session again. So I also host fundraisers throughout the year for my members because we raise money. The average realtor gives about $150 to the PAC, but we have 20,000 members. So I think our participation rate is like 45% or something like that. So last year we raised $1.3 million. So that makes us the biggest PAC in the state. For other realtor organizations, that's not even close to being true. There are many other organizations that raise money, but in Utah, there aren't very many associations that have the infrastructure that mine does and that they've had for a really long time. And I didn't make it, I inherited it, but I'll ride this gravy train as long as they'll have me. All right. Is that a question, or are you going to the bathroom?
No question, just not sure what,
Okay.
just not sure which way you should go.
You're fine.
Got to come up with a question now.
He's like, well.
What would you say were, I want to say most helpful classes at BYU, but I'd say what kinds of skills did you feel like you got from the BYU classes you took?
Yeah. So I took a public speaking class at BYU. I don't even know if they still offer it. I think they do. But I took a public speaking class that ended up being one of the hardest, weirdest, best things that I did at BYU. It's like a 2-credit class. I've never felt more uncomfortable in my entire life. Our final was like a heckler. Like, this guy brought in his friend, and he just heckled you during your speech, and you were graded on how well you handled the heckler. And I was telling this like inspirational story, and he like gave the punchline before I gave the punchline, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have never felt more comfortable in my entire life. But I learned a lot about storytelling and delivery in that class, which was really good. It was really interesting. I took persuasive writing, which was another really, really helpful class. I think it's rhetoric and something.
Is that Poly 200? Or?
No, that's not a poly. That's an English class.
Oh, okay.
That's an English class. And then
And the public speaking is probably some kind of calm.
it was like in the like a musical theater or like acting. It was like
Theater.
somewhere else. Yeah, it wasn't. I don't even know how I stumbled upon it, but my roommates and I took it, and it was an experience. And then in terms of poli-sci classes, Adam Brown's class was really helpful about state and local politics because that's what I went into. If that's.
Did you do the state legislative internship?
I did not.
Given that you work in the Capitol, is that program, do you see that program as being helpful?
Oh, 100%. It was awesome. Yeah, no, it's awesome. Yeah.
Interested in working in the Capitol?
It's a great way to meet people. It's a great way to see the different jobs that you could do, because there's everything from a legislative analyst or a fiscal analyst or a lawyer that drafts bills or a comms person or a lobbyist, or just so many things that you can see kind of work, and you can see their day-to-day. And so I would 100% recommend it. You meet so many interesting people, and I think that you learn a lot of really valuable skills. Mostly it teaches you how to work on the fly and like basically not in an office like all over the place, because I don't know that you're ever in one spot for very long. And that is a skill that I don't think a lot of people have. A lot of people have to be very comfortable at their desk to be able to be productive, but the internship really helps you, I think, kind of learn how to work on the go and manage your time. In terms of poli-sci classes, so I liked Adams because I worked in state and local politics, but also 200 and 328, like I didn't go into data. I have some friends that did, and they're very good at it, and they're very smart. And I appreciate that they did so that I don't have to, but I can ask them questions still. But there is something about those classes that allows you to be able to understand data in a better way. And the more that you can understand it, the better you can explain it to someone who won't. And so that was one of the most helpful things for me. All the poli-sci classes that I took because I loved them and I was interested in them. But the background knowledge that I gained helped me use my comm skills to explain it in a simpler way. Like I used to run my budget explanation past my mom all the time, because she is an older lady in Las Vegas who does not care about Utah politics at all. And I would be like, tell me if this makes sense. And those are the classes that I think are the most helpful. But if you can sign up for public speaking, I would do it. It's so weird and so fun. The last thing I'll say is that you're at BYU, and there is a cool element about BYU that is spiritual. And the thing that I think that you can and should take from your faith and your time at BYU is this idea that we can always be better. Repentance isn't only for spiritual things, and forgiveness isn't only for spiritual things. There will be times where you mess up at work, or you do not perform the way that you think that you will, or the way that you hope that you will. And the skills that we learn in church from primary on to be able to forgive ourselves and to constantly be looking to be better will only help you with work, but only as long as you can forgive yourself. You can't hold on to some of the dumb stuff that you've done forever. If I did, I would never be able to sleep because I've done a lot of dumb stuff. But thank you for having me.